Good evening, everybody, and welcome to From Anguish to Action, the Jewish Community Conference supporting the Uyghurs. My name is Joel Kenigsberg. I'm the Rabbi of Magen Avot Synagogue in Hendon, and I'm honored to be introducing tonight's conference. I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody who has worked tirelessly to ensure that this event could take place, to the entire team at Magen Avot, as well as to the other supporting synagogues at Muswell Hill and Hampstead, to the team at the United Synagogue led by Richard Verba on the technical, the broadcast, and the promotional side of tonight's event, the Jewish News, our official media partner, as well as our generous sponsors, including the Chief Rabbi Center for Community Excellence, World Jewish Relief, and Yad Vashem UK. I want to thank you all for your support in making this happen, and thank all of you that are watching right now, all of you at home who've taken the time to join us tonight for such an important cause. We have a dizzying array of speakers who will be joining us tonight. And I think that very fact, just looking at who will be addressing us tonight from such diverse backgrounds, should highlight what an important issue this is, what a cross-communal issue this is, and a matter of concern for all of us. I mentioned at the outset, this conference is titled the Jewish Community Conference Supporting the Uyghurs, but of course, not all of our speakers are Jewish. I'm sure not all of our audience is either. This is not just a Jewish issue. This is a human issue. And as the evidence becomes clearer of the suffering, of the atrocities, indeed of the genocide that is being perpetrated against the Uyghurs in China, we simply cannot remain silent. We need to speak up. We need to cry out. But more than that, we need to act. And that's what tonight's conference is all about, going from anguish to action. So the format for tonight will be 3 panel discussions, each one taking a different area in terms of how we can respond to this issue, looking at the religious and ethical and moral imperative, looking at political action, and looking at effective consumer protest. And so without further ado, let's begin. For the opening words, I'm honored to introduce the Chief Rabbi, Rabbi Ephraim Mervis.
Good evening, everyone. At the outset, I would like to congratulate everyone responsible for organizing this significant event. For me and my office, it is an honor for us to be associated with the From Anguish to Action conference. I'd like to extend a particular Yasher Koach congratulations to Julian Pollard and his team. Thank you so much, not just for having the dream, but for translating it this evening into reality. This event benefits from a very impressive array of guest speakers, people who are willing to speak out for truth, for what is right, and for constructive action. And included in the lineup is Imam Karyasim, whom I would like to congratulate for his truly outstanding interfaith activity. The Bible in the book of Exodus describes how Moses at the burning bush was appointed by God to be the leader of the Israelite nation, to go back to Egypt and to take the Israelites therefrom. But what immediately preceded the appointment of Moses? How does the Bible describe the qualities of leadership which he had, as a result of which he merited that appointment? In the passage immediately preceding it, we are told how Moses, an Israelite, was raised in the Egyptian palace of King Pharaoh. And when he was old enough, he went out to seek his brethren. On one occasion, he saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a fellow Israelite to the extent that had Moses not intervened, the Israelite would have died. But to save the Israelite, Moses struck the Egyptian. He buried his body. On the following day, it was obvious to him that the news was out. Pharaoh himself heard what Moses had done, and he needed to flee for his life. He came to the land of Midian, and there the Bible takes us immediately to a scene at a wellside. Moses arrives, and he sees that the lady shepherds are being ignored, and instead the male shepherds are tending to their flocks. First come, first served doesn't apply there. Moses saw this injustice. He stood up for the women shepherds, and he himself watered their flocks. As a result, they came home early that day. Their father, Jethro, said, "How is it possible that you're so early?" They said, "There's a new man in town." And Moses was then introduced to Tzipporah, daughter of Jethro, whom he married. And it is at that point that the Bible tells us Moses went out to tend the flocks of Jethro. He came to the burning bush, and the rest, as they say, is all history. For me, there is a very powerful and eternally relevant message here. What makes a great Jewish leader? First of all, like Moses, we need to care about our fellow Jews. When we see an injustice being carried out towards other Jews, we must stand up to be counted. We must fight for the rights of our fellow Jews. And we must guarantee the safety of all Jewish people around the globe, particularly during trying and challenging times. But that's not our only responsibility. From that scene in Egypt, the Bible immediately transports us to the well side in Midian. And from Moses, we learn that we have an equally important responsibility to stand up for the rights of others. Moses in Midian was defending the rights of people he had never ever met before. He was an outsider. Indeed, even his life was in danger at that point, had his identity become fully known. Nonetheless, that didn't stop him from doing what was right for total strangers whose rights were being denied. And it is this very recognition which enabled Moses to become our great leader. And if we are to emulate his ways, we likewise must look after our own and also be sensitive to the needs and requirements of everybody right around the world. For indeed, in the book of Genesis, we are taught that every human being is created in the image of Almighty God. It is in this very spirit that this conference has been planned this evening. We care about the welfare and the needs, indeed the lives and well-being of so many Uyghurs in China today. Our own past experiences of horror make us as Jews all the more sensitive to the needs and desperate situation of others, as a result of which, like Moses, we need to stand up to be counted in order that we can try our best to do something to help. And what I like about the title is we're not just recognizing the anguish that is being experienced at this time, we need to engage in action. Thank you so much, all of you, for being part of the event this evening. I have no doubt whatsoever that this evening's proceedings will contribute, even in a small way, towards the overall global effort to do something constructive and meaningful in order to change the situation in China, in order that the future of the Uyghurs will hopefully be bright. Have a good evening, and God bless you all.
Thank you, Chief Rabbi, for those powerful and poignant words. And now I have the pleasure of chairing our first session. The topic of session 1 is Interfaith and Ethical and Moral Imperatives. And we have quite an esteemed panel of speakers before us. I'm going to briefly introduce each of our speakers. And following that, I'm going to ask each one of them in turn, one by one, please to just, for the first 5 minutes, tell us a little bit about how you are involved with this issue and giving us a little bit of your opening perspective. So first of all, we have Imam Karyasim, MBE, with us this evening. Imam Karyasim is the senior imam at the Makkah Mosque in Leeds. Under his leadership, the mosque has won a number of awards, including being voted the UK's model mosque. He's also a senior lawyer at a global law firm, and he's well known for his interfaith work, having led a number of groundbreaking initiatives to bridge the gap between communities. We also have Benedict Rogers, representing Christian Solidarity Worldwide. Benedict is a British human rights activist and journalist based in London. His work focuses primarily on Asia, and he's a regular contributor to many print journals, as well as having appeared online on many TV stations and radio channels as well. And he's also an advisor to the World Uyghur Congress. We also have joining us Rahima Mahmoud from the World Uyghur Congress, who on an evening like this I'm sure needs no introduction. Rahima is a London-based Uyghur singer, award-winning translator and human rights activist. She's very well known in the Jewish community and beyond for her work in highlighting this important issue and sharing from her personal perspective, and we look forward to hearing from her as well. We also have Henry Grunwald, OBE, QC, who's the head of World Jewish Relief and the former president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Henry is a vice president of the Jewish Leadership Council, and he was awarded the OBE in 2009 for his services to the Jewish community and interfaith relations. And finally, we have Rabbi Dr. Michael Harris of Hampstead Synagogue. Rabbi Harris has published articles in many scholarly journals, as well as in newspapers, including The Guardian and the Jewish Chronicle. He's taught on BA and MA programs at King's College London. He's formerly an affiliated lecturer in the Faculty of Divinity in Cambridge. He's a regular speaker in many synagogues, the annual Limud Festival, JW3, and other venues within the Jewish community and abroad. So thank you all for joining us and for being on this panel tonight. I think to begin with, we'll turn to you, Rahima, and thank you for being here tonight. And could you just, for 5 minutes, tell us a little bit about your perspective on this issue?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I am extremely moved by Chief Rabbi's speech earlier, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Jewish friends for taking this issue very seriously. And for the last 2 years, I cannot believe the amount of people that we have managed to mobilize and fighting to stop the Uyghur genocide. I am Uyghur, and I left my country in 2000 after a massacre happened in my city of Khulja in 1997. And I always hoped that one day I would be able to return home, things might get better. But however, I was never able to return home. And then from 2017, January, I completely forcibly cut off from all my family members and friends from my hometown of Khulja and in the region, the East Turkestan. At the moment, people already, hopefully already know that what is happening is the largest internment since the Holocaust. Up to 2 to 3 million Uyghurs and other Muslims are interned in this, the so-called re-education camps, in fact, are concentration camps. Recently, I have translated for a tribunal, the Uyghur tribunal that was took place in June from the 4th till the 7th, and the account of the witnesses is absolutely harrowing. And from the Chinese own aim, from their leaked documents, it said very clearly their aim is break the Uyghurs' lineage, break their roots, break their connections, and break their origins. And the horrific testimonies I witnessed and translated for the Uyghur tribunal confirmed the extreme heights that religious persecution has reached in my homeland. And one academic gave evidence on state documents that described Uyghurs as rats and Islam as virus and a mental illness. An ex-policeman from the camp testified that who worked in the region and testified that Uyghurs were arrested because the Chinese state automatically considered them as terrorists. He also described how once in the camps, those accused of religious crimes faced routine torture. He testified that in order to force Uyghurs to reject their religion, some had their limbs were tied and water pipes were inserted in their mouths to force water into their lungs. And women from the tribunal too shared harrowing stories, accounts of forced labor, rape, forced sterilization, and marriages. And there are even accounts of organ harvesting. And I am extremely pleased that we bring everyone together today, very powerful speakers, to discuss not only the anguish, but the action. So I would like to say that for my call for today, 3 actions I would like people to do. One, write to your MP to vote for the diplomatic boycott motion, which will be voting on Thursday next week. And second, follow us on social media and join the campaign. And third, I would ask you to avoid products of slave labor, Chinese cotton, Zara, Uniqlo, and the high-tech companies involving in surveillance, high-tech surveillance like Huawei. Thank you very much.
Rahima, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'm sure it's not easy to talk about these things from such a close personal perspective. It's always extremely moving to hear you speak. And as you say, those harrowing accounts. And we really hope that this evening will be part of the global effort to really change things and to change things for you and for your people for the better. We'll now introduce our second panelist for the session, Imam Karyasim.
Thank you. I would like to begin by thanking the Magen Avot Synagogue for hosting this significant conference, along with other partners in support of the Uyghur Muslims. May I also take this opportunity to express my deep gratitude to the Jewish community in general, and in particular, the Chief Rabbi Mervis, who is an extraordinary Jewish leader and a bridge builder between communities. And I would like to thank the Jewish community for its sustained effort in raising the voice against the ethnic cleansing of Uyghur Muslims. After the unfathomable mass atrocity, the Holocaust, we said never again. Never again would we allow ethnic cleansing and the systematic persecution of a people. But we have said never again too many times now, and have stood by and watched persecution play out like Rwanda and Srebrenica genocides, and now the Uyghurs. There are reports of concentration camps, as Rahima mentioned. Over 1 million Uyghur and ethnic minorities are forcibly detained in China. Restrictions on religious freedoms, forced imprisonment, forced labor, sterilization of women, organ harvesting, the separation of children from their parents, and a culture of intimidation and fear have become the norm for Uyghurs. Yet the international community, by and large, remains relatively silent in challenging the campaign against freedom of religion and belief and freedom of movement of Uyghurs. However, the title of today's conference, From Anguish to Action, urges us to do more to combat deliberate and systematic brutality and persecution of Uyghurs. We know from our rich religious traditions that neither our father, Prophet Abraham, nor prophets Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad remained silent in the face of atrocities and injustices committed against communities. And I'm proud to say that the Chief Rabbi very eloquently mentioned the beautiful story of how Prophet Moses stood up against injustices that were happening in respect of those shepherds. And I can relate to that tradition, as the similar tradition is contained in the Quran. And the Quran also goes on to say, urging us to act rather than just leave it at condemning something. The Quran says in chapter 4, verse 135, "O you who believe, be upholders of justice, witness for God Almighty, even though it goes against your own interests." So there is an internal lesson, an extremely important lesson for us, that we must speak out, even if it goes against our personal and economic interests. The responsibility to act is brought into sharp focus this week. Today, July 11th, marks the 26th anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide. Srebrenica genocide took place just a quarter of a century ago. And it took the lives of more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys and is considered as the worst atrocity on European soil since World War II. The world must not fail Uyghurs as it did with Srebrenica Muslims. I hope that at today's important conference, we can come together to realize that we must do more. Our similarities and shared values and identity surpasses our differences. For Muslims, it's so reassuring to constantly have the support and value of other faith communities, in particular the Jewish community, because whatever our faiths or experiences, it's important we use these moments to stand together shoulder to shoulder. We must learn the lessons of history to help tackle hatred, and anti-Muslim sentiments and anti-Semitism are on the rise, and they continue to challenge our communities, and we must challenge those who continue to spread hatred against our respective communities. Racism and demonization in whatever form and against whoever is something that's stain on humanity. The political leadership of the world must take decisive and robust actions to stop the genocide of Uyghur minority community, but also stop the hatred against our respective communities. Doing nothing to stop injustice or persecution is not an option for humanity. Our religions and moral compass urges us to stand up for justice and play our part. In our lifetime, we have witnessed that whenever ordinary people speak out, even when the victims are suffering on the other side of the world, change eventually occurs. That is how we can bring change for Uyghur Muslims. As followers of Abrahamic faiths, we must all speak out if we see hatred, intolerance, and racism, and encourage those in positions of influence and power to do the same. We must continue to urge our political leadership, but also as children of Abraham, when we stand together, we send out a strong and clear message to all those who would threaten human dignity, no matter how big and mighty they may be. So today's event is a significant conference in which various communities have come together to say that enough is enough and we must not tolerate the persecution and genocide of Uyghurs. Thank you.
Thank you, Imam Karyasim, and let me thank you and let me commend you as well for speaking out as you have done, and for speaking out as you do courageously against hatred and against injustice, against your community, against our communities, against communities worldwide. And there's something very moving tonight about being here together, representatives of different faiths. But as you say, certainly on this issue, our common ground is much greater than the differences between us. And we hope we can work together to fight against this injustice. Our third speaker for the panel tonight is Benedict Rogers, human rights activist.
Good evening. Well, it's a very great privilege to be at this very important conference and to speak alongside the other very distinguished speakers. And I want to start by thanking the Magen Avot Synagogue for organizing this. It is both timely and well-timed, and I want to congratulate you for both. It's timely because there are a number of things that have just happened and are about to happen in Parliament, which I'll say a bit more about in a few moments. And so this event is particularly timely, but it's also very well timed, if I may say so, fitting it in between most of the Wimbledon final and ahead of the big match tonight. So congratulations on that. And I also want to say a big thank you to the Jewish community as a whole for your leadership on this issue, from the Chief Rabbi, who we just heard from and who I know has spoken out on a number of other occasions, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, Jewish News, many rabbis, and my own hero, the much-loved and much-missed former Chief Rabbi, Rabbi Lord Sachs. So thank you to all of you for your important leadership on this. I want to highlight two key points for you to take away from this event. The first is the importance of interfaith action, and I entirely agree with and salute what Imam Karyasim has just said, the importance of interfaith action, and then what action is needed. On the importance of interfaith action, I think it is incredibly important that people of different faith communities, and indeed people of no faith, recognize that this is one of the greatest contemporary injustices and tragedies, mass atrocities of our time. And it's something that affects our common humanity and that all of us should engage with. And that is happening. In August last year, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, led a statement signed by over 75 leaders of both religious and belief communities. That statement included Imam Karyasim and other imams, the president of the Buddhist Society, the representative of the Dalai Lama, the chief executive of Humanists UK, 7 Anglican bishops and a number of other Anglican priests, the Catholic cardinals of Myanmar and Indonesia, and the former master of the Catholic Dominican order, Father Timothy Radcliffe, and Bishop Declan Lang on behalf of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales, and about 20 rabbis. And that, I think, was a very significant statement. It was followed up just last month ahead of the G7 summit in Cornwall with a similar letter from religious leaders and an event hosted on the sidelines of the G7 by the Bishop of Truro and the Coptic Orthodox Archbishop of London, Archbishop Angelos. And I know Rahima and others spoke at that. And next week in Washington, D.C., there's an International Religious Freedom Summit where I know that the Uyghur genocide will feature highly. There are 2 Christian leaders, and I can say this as a Christian myself, as a Catholic and a former Anglican, 2 of the world's Christian leaders who have yet to speak out, Pope Francis and the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I certainly am doing everything I can. I've written about this quite widely, and I'm doing everything I can respectfully to encourage them that the time has come for their voices to be heard as well. But let me go on to what action is needed, because statements are important, and statements from religious leaders are very important because they send the moral message about the need for action. But the question is, what action do we take? And it's worth remembering that the genocide is being increasingly recognized. The previous US administration and the current US administration have recognized it as a genocide. The Canadian, Belgian, Lithuanian, Czech, and British parliaments have recognized it as a genocide, and an independent tribunal, the Uyghur Tribunal, chaired by the barrister who prosecuted Slobodan Milosevic, is underway to further investigate the claims of genocide. Last week, the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee published a very important report titled Never Again, the UK's responsibility to act on atrocities in Xinjiang and beyond. And it sets out a range of recommendations. And I strongly agree with Rahima's call to write to your MPs. I would urge you to write to your MPs to encourage them to press the government to adopt the recommendations of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee report and to look up that report, which just came out last Thursday. But also, as Rahima has said, this coming Thursday, Tim Lawton MP has a motion in the House of Commons calling for, firstly, the Winter Olympics in 2022, which are due to be held in Beijing, to be moved to a different country, a country where human rights are respected and protected. But if that can't happen, it calls for the British government to impose a diplomatic boycott, that no government officials, royalty, VIPs, diplomats should attend any of the ceremonies or functions associated with the Olympics. And I would go further to encourage a corporate boycott, a boycott by sponsors, and a consumer boycott. But you can write in the next day or two, anytime before Thursday, to your MP to ask them to support that motion. And you can find information about that on the website of the organisation yet again. So let me just close by thanking you once again for this opportunity. And I leave you with the words which echo Imam Karyasim's remarks, the words of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee report, which in its opening section ends with the following. After every major atrocity and tragedy, the world says never again. It is happening again, and it is not too late to act. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Ben, for your, again, for your remarkable and tireless work on this and bringing together such a diverse array of people and leaders in order to speak out and, as you say, in order to act. You mentioned some of the diplomatic initiatives, and in the second session, we'll be hearing a lot more about those as well. We've got some MPs who will be joining us this evening, and I'm sure we'll hear more about those initiatives in greater detail. Let me just remind our listeners and viewers that if you do have questions for any of our panelists, you can submit them. As you can see now on your screen, there's an email address, hello@theus.tv, or if you're watching on Facebook, you can put it in the comments, and time permitting, we'll be able to put those questions to our panelists as well. Moving on now to our next panelist, the former president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, Henry Grunwald, OBE.
Rabbi Königsberg, thank you very much. And friends, this is a really important event, and let me echo what's been said by way of gratitude to those who've organized it. I'm the son of a refugee. My late father landed in this country on the 4th of August 1939, 1 month before war broke out from Czechoslovakia, and was allowed in as a racial refugee. He was the lucky one of his very large family, almost all of whom were murdered in the Holocaust. I'm now president of World Jewish Relief, an organization which began its life in 1933 as the Central British Fund for German Jewry. It helped some 60,000 refugees get into this country from 1933, before, during, and after the Second World War. Then we helped refugees because they were Jewish. Now we help refugees because we are Jewish. We recognize the responsibility that we as Jews have, not only to our fellow Jews, as the Chief Rabbi said, but also to others in need. And over the years of our existence, we've helped many thousands of refugees of all faiths and of none all over the world. 1 year ago, last July, satellite imagery emerged showing Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang kneeling, blindfolded as they waited to be led onto trains. The resonance of this footage with our own history, the images of the trains being loaded in particular, shook the Jewish community and made it impossible for anyone to ignore. Our collective memory of our own history is so powerful that leaders of our community across the religious and political spectrum felt a duty publicly to highlight and condemn the treatment of Uyghur Muslims at a time when much of the rest of the world failed to raise their voices and join our condemnation. We've heard, and Rahima, I want to thank you not only for speaking to us tonight, but for the interview you gave with World Jewish Relief recently. We've heard what's happening on the ground in China. Defenders of the Chinese actions say that what is happening is not genocide. Well, my friends, we know that genocide doesn't begin with mass extermination. Genocide never just happens. There is always a set of circumstances which occur or are created to build the climate in which genocide can take place. It's now generally accepted that there are 10 stages of genocide, beginning with classification, moving through symbolization to discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, and extermination, followed by denial. There can be no doubt that what the Chinese government refers to as re-education puts the Uyghurs' culture, religion, and way of life at risk of extinction. And I don't know which of the stages of the 10 stages of genocide we've reached. But I do know that we cannot afford to wait until legal definitions are agreed before doing what we can to help. The world should unanimously condemn what is happening in China, and our voices, all of our religious voices, should be heard loudly in that condemnation. But condemnation is not enough. Our religion unambiguously advocates that to be a bystander in the face of human suffering is tantamount to perpetrating injustice yourself. So inaction is not an option for us as Jews. And that's why World Jewish Relief, realizing the difficulties of helping the persecuted in China itself because of the nature of Chinese society, recently launched an appeal to raise funds. The appeal remains open on our website to raise funds to assist some 6,000 of the most vulnerable Uyghur refugees in Turkey who face daily challenges and live in fear of internment. And our community has responded magnificently, because we as Jews know that this is assistance we must provide to these refugees in need. So as a humanitarian organization, we provide practical assistance to those refugees to try and improve their lives, as that is an imperative for us, to provide psychological support for those who need it, to provide legal support for those who need it, to provide medical support and services to those who need it, to provide language classes for children. In Turkey, language classes not only in Turkish, but also in their own language, to provide assistance to women with handicraft skills to develop them and market them, to support themselves and their families, and of course, to provide food packages to those who need it. All of that is a religious and ethical imperative, and that is why we do it. I want to raise one important and connected matter about refugees and asylum seekers in general. This conference is a great initiative, and I'm sure that all of us, apart from trying to help the Uyghurs in China and refugees in other parts of the world, would wish to assist any Uyghurs seeking asylum in the United Kingdom. I don't want to introduce party political issues into this evening, because the Uyghur case has had amazing support from right across the political spectrum. United Kingdom law at present makes it an offence for someone who knowingly and for gain facilitates the arrival or the entry or attempted entry into this country of an individual whom he knows or has reasonable cause to believe that that individual is an asylum seeker. The new Nationality and Borders Bill presented by the Home Office seeks to remove the words "and for gain" from the offence. So a law aimed at people smugglers raising money from the most unfortunate in the world, a law aimed at them in the past, would make it an offence for anyone who not for gain facilitates the entry or attempted entry into this country of an asylum seeker. And if passed, it would appear to mean that someone like the late Sir Nicholas Winton, who facilitated the arrival of many Jewish children here on kinder transport, could have been criminalized, and that any of us who, because it is the right thing to do, facilitated the entry of a Uyghur asylum seeker into the UK could have committed a criminal offence. And so I hope that if the bill is presented to Parliament in its current form, politicians from all parties will ensure that the words "for gain" are not removed. So to conclude, let us ensure that we do the right thing by the Uyghur community at this critical moment. We cannot stand by in the face of human suffering. Our religion requires us to respond to their plight. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you for those powerful words and for those powerful actions. It is inspiring to hear the way that you have drawn on our collective memory and our collective experience as a people in order to go and to help others and really to alleviate suffering wherever we can do so. And we now move on to our final panelist for the session, Rabbi Dr. Michael Harris.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Königsberg, and thank you all friends for joining us for this most important event, and sincere thanks to all those who have been involved in arranging the conference, and particularly Magen Avot for leading this wonderful initiative in which it's a privilege to be involved. Friends, I just want to echo what all the previous panelists in this session have said from the perspective of one absolutely central and key Jewish thinker, termed by some the most famous Jew of the medieval era, namely Maimonides, who refer to in Jewish tradition as Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, Rabbi Moshe, the son of Maimon. And Maimonides, in his magnum opus, his great code of Jewish law, the Mishneh Torah, really crystallizes some of the observations which have been made by the distinguished speakers on our panel this evening. Maimonides says in chapter 9 of Laws of Servants in his great code that Jewish people, having received the Torah, have a very deep obligation to be compassionate, and not just to be compassionate, but he says in the Hebrew, Rachmanim al Hakol, compassionate towards everyone, towards all of creation. And then he adds something which appears at first sight to be just a repetition, but in fact is getting at something much deeper. What Maimonides adds in that chapter is that being compassionate, we fulfill the religious obligation, the commandment of the Torah, of imitatio Dei, of imitating the ways of God. And God is compassionate. As one of the verses in the Hebrew Bible says, V'rachamav al kol ma'asav, God's mercies extend to his entire creation. And when we are commanded to be compassionate, we are commanded to do so by imitating God, who is compassionate. And that is extremely significant, because one might be compassionate by following, as it were, a rule book, by looking up, by consulting experts, consulting books. When is it that one should act compassionately? But when we are told by our tradition to imitate God, who is compassionate, that means we have to work on ourselves to take on compassion as a characteristic, that being compassionate becomes an automatic part of our character, so that when we witness oppression and the suffering of others, we automatically, out of our very compassionate nature, cannot stand by and step in. It's what contemporary philosophers call virtue ethics. It's not the ethics just of action, it's the personality, the moral personality that we must develop inside ourselves. And once we become compassionate people, people of compassionate character, then it follows automatically, as Maimonides says, that our compassion extends to all of humanity and to all of creation. Because it is impossible for a person who has a genuinely compassionate nature to restrict his or her compassion to a certain portion of humanity or a certain portion of creation. We are to become compassionate people, emulating God's compassionate character. And if we do that, then automatically our compassion extends to everyone. And so within Jewish teaching, as the previous speakers have highlighted, we have an ethical reach that is global. We are extremely proud in the Jewish community, as other communities rightly are proud in other faiths of their own traditions. We are fiercely proud of our distinctive particular tradition. But that very tradition teaches that from that matrix of a particular strong cultural and religious identity, we must reach out and embrace all of those who are created in the image of God, the entire human family, And there is perhaps no portion of that family that requires our help, our support, and our action more than the Uyghur community in China. And finally, let me say it's not just compassion. Next Sunday, a week from today, is the fast of the 9th of Av, commemorating the destruction of the temples, the saddest day in the Jewish calendar. But as is typical in Jewish tradition, we try and focus on hope as well. And in the prophetic reading from Isaiah, this coming Shabbat, this coming Sabbath, we'll say in our synagogues the verse Tzion b'mishpat tipadeh v'shaveh b'tzedakah, that Zion will be redeemed and the tragedy of the destruction of Jerusalem will be reversed, but only through justice and through righteousness. And as much as compassion, the Jewish and ethical imperatives of justice and righteousness compel us to do whatever we can to help the Uyghur community. So friends, thank you all so much for joining us. And it is a great privilege to be working together with members of the Jewish community and members of other faith communities and a wide spectrum of men and women of goodwill to do whatever we can to improve the plight of the Uyghur community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Harris. Thank you for those inspiring words, looking at some of the philosophical, I suppose, theological underpinnings of, what should be so self-evident about the responsibility and the imperative that we all do have to show compassion and to support and to fight against injustice wherever it is. Thank you. So it's really been, we've just got all our panelists back with us now. It's really been an inspiring 45 minutes. Certainly for me, it is a privilege to be here in this company and to have heard from you all. I think, we all agree, and having heard, such powerful words and from all of the speakers, we all agree on the ethical imperative. We all agree on the religious imperatives. We all agree that whatever our faiths are, we have very much common ground here. I think you've all mentioned the fact that it's not just about speaking, but it's also about action as well. So I guess the question is, we've mentioned some broad initiatives on a communal level, as Jewish, Muslim, Christian communities together. What is there that can be done on an interfaith level? How can we bring our communities together in order to work on this issue, in order to raise the awareness and really to promote all the things which you've spoken about? Imam Asim, maybe we'll begin with you.
Thank you so much. I think firstly, just elaborating on what all the speakers have said, that we have a lot more in common than that which divides us. And it's extremely important that we symbolically show that we stand together, because I think that in itself carries a huge power. And also when you speak for the other, if you like, because we are living in a culture where it's become normalized to other, those communities that perhaps or groups that are not of the same ilk or the same thinking or the same background, and therefore it becomes extremely powerful when you stand up against injustices or intolerance towards the other. Just to give you an example, so in Leeds, not long ago, we held a conference whereby we had three faith leaders, and the Jewish faith leader spoke about the anti-Muslim hatred, and I, as an imam, spoke about anti-Semitism, so standing in the shoe of the other, and the Christian leader spoke about the persecution of the Jewish community over the centuries. So, and it was very powerful, and I think young people took something away from that actually it becomes extremely pertinent and powerful when you speak, when you stand in the shoe of the other, to help people realize what's happening around the world. I sometimes say that, well, if in a sentence, if you just change the word if you're speaking about the other community, and if you change the word like a Muslim to a Jew or a Jew to a Christian, and if you are from that same community, how would you feel about it? And so I think, just to conclude, I'll say that it's very symbolic when we stand together, but then people take more notice of what we want to say collectively.
Thank you. If any of our other panelists would like to comment on that,
just to build on what the Imam has said, a Uyghur Muslim would be expected to speak out publicly against what is happening in China. His or her voice will be heard. But if alongside him or her you have people of other faiths, if that Uyghur Muslim stands alongside a Jew, stands alongside a member of a Christian denomination, then the voices become more powerful and the chances of their being listened to increase exponentially the more from different communities we can bring together with the same message.
Can I briefly, just very briefly, I agree entirely with Imam Karyasim and with Henry. And just to further build on what they have said, I think there are four things that we could all do. The first is to continue to speak together and stand together. The second is to disseminate that message to our communities. So, for example, the statement issued in August last year by over 75 religious leaders that I mentioned earlier, in future, if there are statements like that, to make sure our communities know about that. And then finally, I think there are two concrete things that we can do together kind of as our respective communities. One is spiritual and the other is activist. I think in our different traditions, we will have diverse ways of doing this, but I think all of us in our different ways can pray for the Uyghurs, pray for China as a whole, and then secondly, mobilize our communities to do the things that Rahima and I outlined in terms of writing to MPs. So those are four thoughts to complement what's already been said.
Thank you, Ben. I think that's a really important point as well. I think we would be amiss if we had a session on, religious imperatives and we didn't mention prayer. Certainly, coming from a Jewish perspective within our tradition, it's very much a part of our liturgy is that we look, not only inwards, but we most definitely look outwards and look towards the suffering. And that is certainly something that we are becoming more aware of in our community, and I think others as well. As was mentioned before, we're on somewhat of a tight schedule. We still have another 2 sessions to come this evening. So I'm going to, at this point, ask you to wrap it up, where each of the speakers will have an opportunity to just two minutes to give us any closing thoughts, any other comments you'd like to make about that which has been said, which has already been deeply inspiring. So Rahima.
I cannot thank, Magen Avot and many other organizers came together to do this event. It's so moving, and for me, as being an Uyghur who is suffering from this atrocity, from this genocide, not knowing what happened to all my loved ones back home, and also hearing people sometimes just deny that or even doubt about this is happening in this 21st century. And I think it is so important that people come together regardless of the background that we speak, and tell the truth, show support. Often people question me, China is so powerful, there is nothing people can do, nothing can stop them. And that really make me sometimes quite angry. I try not to become angry. I try to, show strength and also believe in hope. I think the hope is extremely important for Uyghurs now survive. At the moment, anything more than survive is kind of luxury, especially people inside inside East Turkestan, the Uyghur region, the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So therefore, each of you today, that what you said is important, and it will make change. We must believe that will make change. And thank you so much. And I do believe this darkness will, end one day. But it has to be people like you, more people, all faith must, take this on and show compassion and do whatever they can to stop this genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahima. Certainly, I don't think anybody watching can remain indifferent after hearing those words. Rabbi Harris.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Königsberg. And thank you, Rahima, for another very powerful set of words. And again, thanks to everyone. I just want to pick up on something that Benedict said. You mentioned your hero, late Chief Rabbi Sachs, of blessed memory. Rabbi Sachs has an extraordinarily powerful piece in one of his essays on the Torah, in which he talks about the two faces of evil. That evil faces outwards and, of course, does great harm to those who are victims of evil. But also evil has a terrible impact on the perpetrators of evil. And when you talk about prayer, Benedict, perhaps we can find room in our hearts to pray for those in China who are perpetrating these terrible actions against the Uyghur community, that they should have a change of heart, to try and make them understand that they are doing evil, terrible evil to the Uyghur community, but also evil to themselves. And I noticed in the chat we have a question from my friend and our congregant, Gabriel Herman, who asks about reminding the Chinese about how they protected Jews during the Second World War. I'm not an expert on the history of China in the Second World War, but of course everyone knows that China was a great civilization, and it is a country with such a role in world history. And perhaps part of our prayer and part of our public advocacy might be to try and say to China, we need you to act in the best traditions of your own history. We need you to reflect on the damage that you are doing, not just to others, but to yourselves, so that we can move forward, as Rahima put it, from dark situation, please God, to one of hope and of light. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Harris. Imam Asim, if I can ask you in just 2 minutes your concluding thoughts.
Thank you. Just a couple of points. I think firstly, sometimes we can become very hopeless and feel that there's nothing that we can do because the opponent is so powerful, so mighty. But we have seen in our own lifetimes how change can happen. And change happens when people come together, not only just to condemn, but also take small acts of, sometimes small acts of kindness towards the victims. Other times it's about upholding justice. So today's conference, I hope, will provide us with an opportunity to reflect on our personal and professional lives, to show that those who raise a voice against prejudice, hatred of the other and racism, those who stand up and unite against hatred can and will make a difference. It's never been so important for people to be empowered to confront hatred in the world, to build bridges that help create a stronger, better and more cohesive world for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Henry?
One brief point. I said when I gave the definition of the 10 stages of genocide that stage 10 was denial. And it is, looking back on what people have done. But denial is very much in the fore of what the Chinese government is doing at the moment. And we know that they seek to present what they are doing as a method of dealing with terrorism, as a method of re-education, as a method of improving the economic lot of the people that they are in fact persecuting and whose culture they are trying to extinguish. And I think it's really important from us at the same time as we remember the compassion that Rabbi Harris spoke so powerfully about, that we have to take every opportunity of denying the denial, of pointing out that what is happening in China is not what the Chinese government and those who apologize for them throughout the world are holding out as happening. We have to speak up and point to the truth of what is happening and show that they are denying the undeniable. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very, very important point as well to end off. And finally, Benedict Rogers, your concluding thoughts, please.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, let me thank you, Rabbi Königsberg, and everybody involved in organizing this really important event. And I look forward really to continuing to work together. Just a couple of very brief concluding thoughts. I really pay tribute to with great respect to the Jewish community for making what I know is a very rare, unusual, and sensitive comparison for you. Comparison between what's happening to the Uyghurs and the Holocaust. And I know just why that's so unusual, but the Board of Deputies and other Jewish leaders have made that comparison. And I think it's worth saying that just as while during the Holocaust, what happened to the Jewish peoples was unique and horrific, of course, many other groups were also affected by the Nazi regime's repression, people of other faith communities and other backgrounds. And I think it's worth remembering that the same thing is happening in China today. So whilst it's right that this event and our work is so focused on the genocide of the Uyghurs, let's remember also that this is part of a wider all-out crackdown by the Chinese Communist Party on everyone, on all forms of dissent, on civil society, on Christians and Falun Gong practitioners and Tibetan Buddhists and Hong Kong. And even if we don't act, we ourselves will be affected by it. The Chinese Communist Party is a threat to freedom itself. And I think that's worth remembering. And then very finally, I agree very much with Rabbi Harris's point about praying for change in the Chinese Communist Party. This year, there was a global week of prayer for China, which was largely a Catholic-driven, not exclusively, but largely a Catholic-driven initiative called by the Cardinal of Myanmar, Cardinal Charles Bo. But I hope that perhaps in coming years, in our diverse ways, we can have global weeks of prayer for change in China, for the Uyghurs in particular, but for everyone suffering under the Chinese Communist Party regime. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you all for what has been incredibly inspiring and I would say very encouraging panel as well. You know, a lot of you have mentioned the idea of hope or lack of hope, and I think just, you know, with the six of us sitting here together and hearing these messages, hearing such powerful messages from people from such diverse backgrounds and such different faiths, you know, we have this common ground. I feel encouraged that together we can act, together we hope and we pray that we can make a difference. So thank you all for everything that you're doing on this issue and for being with us tonight. That concludes the first session. We're now going to take a short 5-minute break. Do please be with us. Again, at 6:10, we'll resume with the second session, looking at political action. What can we really achieve with China?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm speaking now as both the chairman of Magen Avot and as chairman of Yad Vashem UK Foundation. We will now be hearing from faith leaders, politicians and activists discussing practical steps to support the Uyghur community at this conference, which has been spearheaded by us at Magen Avot Synagogue. As our Rabbi Königsberg has said, as Jews and as human beings, we have a responsibility to speak out against injustice and to take the practical steps we can to end this suffering. Yad Vashem is the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, established to commemorate the 6 million Jewish men, women and children murdered by the Nazis and collaborators during the years 1933 to 1945. A principal mission of Yad Vashem is education, so that we in the world can learn from history the dangers and consequences that can arise from racism and lead to the deliberate killing of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. Yad Vashem's International School for Holocaust Studies is the only school of its kind. Every year they host over 350,000 school children, university students, military and security personnel, as well as thousands of educators from around the world. We are raising our voices in protest against the unspeakable atrocities that are being committed today against the Uyghur Muslims.
Thank you for those words. You've just heard from Simon Bentley, the chair of Magen Avot and the chair of Yad Vashem UK. We're now going to begin the second session, dealing with political action, and I have the honor of introducing the chair for this session, Dr. Matthew Offord, the Conservative MP for Hendon. Dr. Offord, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for asking me to chair the event this afternoon. And I believe that this second session will be very interesting to many people. We have some very good speakers, and we also have a short video. So as time is short, I will start off straight away by introducing the speakers. First of all, we have Sir Ian Duncan Smith, the Right Honourable Sir Ian Duncan Smith, who is the Conservative MP for Chingford and Woodford Green, also former leader of the Conservative Party and the Welfare Minister in previous government. After Ian was the leader of the Conservative Party, he went on to fund the Centre for Social Justice, an organisation that has a great deal of influence within the Conservative Party and within policy making. Unfortunately, our second speaker, Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, has been unable to attend today's event. She's had a family issue, so we wish her well, but unfortunately she's not here. But we do have Kelly Eccles-Curry, former UN Ambassador at Large for Women's Issues. And we also have Dr. Alan Mendoza, someone that many of you know, and certainly I do, who's director of the Henry Jackson Society. And someone who needs no introduction, but certainly will receive one from us, is Maria Vanderzill, President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. And we look forward to their comments. The format will be that they will speak for 5 to 7 minutes on the issue of political action. Can we really achieve anything by engaging with China? And then we'll have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. And I'd be grateful if you could email your questions in by using the email hello@theus.tv. So that's hello@theus.tv. And then we'll be able to put our questions to the panel. But before I ask Ian to be the first speaker, can I ask that we have our video, which is on behalf of Rodney Dixon, the Chief Prosecutor from the ICC, on his work on the Commission. So can we please have the video?
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to deliver this message at your very important conference today. My name is Rodney Dixon. I'm a barrister acting on behalf of the East Turkestan government in exile and Uyghur victims. And I have been instructed to launch a case at the International Criminal Court in The Hague in respect of very serious allegations of genocide and crimes against humanity committed against the Uyghur peoples by the Chinese authorities. We have submitted a complaint with evidence to the ICC prosecutor, requesting the prosecutor to open an investigation into these allegations. The International Criminal Court is the only place at the international level where these crimes can be investigated, and then where there is sufficient evidence, prosecuted thereafter. I know you might be asking, well, how does the ICC have jurisdiction when China is not an ICC state party? Well, the answer is a fairly straightforward one, and it comes from the precedent in the Rohingya case at the ICC, which is the following: that if international crimes are committed in ICC state party territories, and then they continue into non-state party territories, in this case, China, then the court does have jurisdiction over the entire criminal conduct. The ICC has held that where an essential element of a criminal offense takes place in an ICC state party, then the court can have jurisdiction irrespective of where the crime continues onwards. So in this case, what we have is cogent evidence of a campaign and policy by the Chinese authorities to round up Uyghurs in many states across the globe, including ICC member states, and to then force them back into China, into East Turkestan, where they are then targeted and persecuted. This policy is one which has been going on for many years. It's taken place in many countries, including some that are signed up to the ICC, in particular, Tajikistan, which is a bordering state of China, and Cambodia. And we have evidence of Uyghurs being arrested there and forced back against their will into East Turkestan. They are never heard from again. These are enforced disappearances over which the ICC has jurisdiction. We also have evidence of Uyghurs escaping because of how they are threatened and persecuted in China into ICC state parties. And going that way also gives the court jurisdiction, because a critical element of the offense takes place in an ICC state party, namely the place where the persons are forced to go. So we have it going both ways. There is clear jurisdiction here to investigate and to prosecute. We have recently provided the ICC prosecutor with up-to-date evidence of what is happening in Tajikistan, in particular, where almost the entire Uyghur population has been rounded up and deported into East Turkestan, where they are then never heard from again. This has all of the ominous echoes of what happened in the Second World War, when Jewish people were rounded up in countries across Europe and forced against their will into Germany, where they were then targeted and exterminated. This is a common element of a well-planned and organized genocide and crime against humanity. And that is why it is so important that the ICC opens an investigation. We are waiting to hear from the prosecutor now, given the recent evidence we have submitted. The prosecutor has said that they will meet with us and discuss the evidence, and we are hopeful that an investigation can be opened in the near future to ensure that these crimes do not go unpunished. For far too long, there have been no investigations, no prosecutions for these appalling acts. It's shameful that nothing has been done at the international level to investigate some of the most serious crimes. Now is the time for the ICC to act. It was set up for this very purpose. We are going to be pursuing this case to ensure that there can be a full investigation, the truth can come out. And where there is sufficient evidence, which we believe there is, then persons can be charged. And if they are charged and they travel outside of China, they can be arrested and put on trial in The Hague. We are at a critical point now where the ICC is going to have to decide what the next step is. And we are calling out widely for support for this case, from governments, from civil society, from NGOs. I would also ask all of you who are tuning in today to support our case, to ensure that it is taken up. It is so vital that this is seen as a priority. We need to take, of course, all steps to halt what is happening. But at the international criminal law level, this is the most compelling one that can be taken. I would implore you to support our case, to spread the word, to provide any information to us if you have that, and to ensure that justice can be finally pursued now, that these acts can both be deterred from happening again and punished. Thank you for your support in this matter. And if you have any questions or wish to have further information about our case, you can get in touch through our webpage. You can support the case as well through our crowdfund, and provide information to us as well through our contacts. We are there to receive that, and we are there to take this forward with full vigor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very informative and also a useful background to our discussion here today. So I'd certainly like to thank you, Rodney, for that contribution. Now, the first of our speakers today, as I said, is Sir Ian Duncan Smith. So Ian, I'd be grateful if you're able to address the conference, please.
Matthew, thank you very much indeed. Rodney Dixon, I think that was an excellent statement. It's very interesting to start this short comment from me with a reminder that even as this conference has been going on over the last few weeks, there has been a full public inquiry going in Church House, chaired by Geoffrey Nice QC, where they've taken evidence from a range of people about whether there is enough cause to believe that genocide has been taking place amongst the Uyghur by the Chinese government. There's some pretty harrowing testimony there. So I'm sure that if this reference to the International Criminal Court is taking place, then that inquiry will have huge importance in that. And the second part of it, which is really important, is that I set up with some other colleagues an organization called IPAC, the Interparliamentary Alliance of China. It's made up of parliamentarians on the left and the right in countries from the free world, countries that believe in democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. And we now have 20 countries from Japan to America, and we have 200 members in those countries as co-chairs, and a few members in the parliaments. So there is a very strong set of evidence. And with that came a man called Adrian Zenz. Adrian has been doing a huge amount of work on what's been going on in Tibet and, of course, more latterly, amongst the Uyghur. And he produced some documents last year which absolutely categorically prove that this terrible and systematic abuse centered around government action is more than just to stop any violence. It's actually a violent act in its own. And he exposed forced sterilizations of the women, he forced labor camps, shipping many thousands of miles away, and children being taken from their families and taught to speak only Mandarin and to throw off any of their references to their ethnicity. So it's a privilege to be here today to follow up on that. As I said earlier on, we've set up IPAC, and therefore the whole idea here is to understand what is going on and why, and then expose it. The Chinese government, it must be clear, is not a government that cares very much about what people think of it or say about it. It is a dictatorial communist regime, and more recently it has now become almost the plaything of President Xi. It was bad enough before, but President Xi's arrival has made it even worse. Their intolerance and their desperate behavior is affecting thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives in China and many beyond. Beyond the terrible persecution of the Uyghur, which literally seems to be a racist act, frankly, where it appears that not just Tibetans, not just the Uyghur, but even now the Inner Mongolians are facing very serious strictures. But it is the Uyghur that in scale and in approach have suffered perhaps the worst. And as I outlined earlier on, the treatment of the Uyghur is a shocking thing to behold in this particular time, particularly as we look back to those events that took place in the 1930s and 40s, which should act as a constant reminder. And to that end, I thank the Jewish community for this conference. The Jewish community has been phenomenal in its support for these investigations into whether the Uyghur are being literally exterminated by an act of government. No doubt that collective memory of what happened to so many Jewish people during the Holocaust has galvanized everybody to do that. But it's going above and beyond even that, really, to persist in this process. And I thank them also for their support when we tried to get the British government in Parliament to accept that a British court could hear a case and could decide whether genocide was being committed. The government resisted that endlessly, but I think we won the argument and won the case, and we did so with a huge amount of support from the Jewish community, and I want to put my thanks on record for that. But we are, let's face it, dealing with a government which I think poses the most significant threat to the free world that we have seen, certainly since the Cold War, and some might think even more so. I mean, this is a government that thinks nothing of the terrible behavior with the Uyghur. Tibetans, nearly between 250,000 million Tibetans themselves are in labor camps, forced labor camps. As I said earlier on, cracking down on the linguistics and ethnicity of the Inner Mongolians. They have trashed Christian churches, arrested those who would call themselves priests of those churches. They have attacked the sect called the Falun Gong. There's been organ harvesting from them that we know of from very clear evidence. They have trashed an international treaty guaranteeing the rights of individuals in Hong Kong under the one country, two systems. Peaceful democracy campaigners have been arrested, banned from the LegCo, and now many of them fleeing for their lives to Western countries. We have a number here in China. We've opened up this passport system, which would allow them to come here. But still, it's a desperate act. And it's also a government that threatens Taiwan on a daily basis, threatens to invade it if they don't become part of China again, and has invaded and occupied the South China Seas, notwithstanding the fact that the UN has told it that it has no rights. The Chinese government has completely ignored them. And so you can see straight away, there's a government with arrogant and aggressive ambitions externally and absolutely authoritarian ambitions internally. The very fact that they are pursuing what, as I said earlier on, I think is beginning to be very clear as a racist policy to crack down on those who are not Han Chinese and to force the children of those who are not Han Chinese to become Han Chinese is an act of racial policy, which I have to say, on a scale like this, that we have not seen since the 30s and 40s. And I said the other day to many in my party and in Parliament, and I do not resile from this, we should remember that the same excuses were being made in the 1930s. Oh, well, Germany's only reasonable. It's been hard treated. It needed to have, these extra areas, and we shouldn't get too fussed about it. It'll be all right in the end. Well, we're saying very similar things about China. The UK and many other Western governments have become utterly dependent economically in exports and imports, and also in some very strategic areas. They've become completely dependent to China. We only have to look at the COVID-19 outbreak, which should have been discovered by the WHO much earlier, but that notwithstanding, millions have died. And during it, of course, we were unable in this country to get hold of any PPE equipment, masks, all the coverings for people working with people. I'm sure people died because they were unable to get. That is at the low scale of how dependent we are. Nuclear energy, electric car production, batteries, rare earth materials. China corners every one of these. And far too often the West has kowtowed to China for fear of upsetting them and losing business. Well, we need to stop. And IPAC is absolutely determined to bring to the attention of governments all over the free world that it's time that we no longer are able to turn a blind eye. We cannot pretend that this is okay. We cannot persuade ourselves that by doing this, China will become a reasonable country, as they thought. Opening up the markets has not turned China into a democratic country that understands the rule of law and human rights. So now we need to take action. We need to show them that their businesses and their economy will suffer if they carry on like this. We need to make sure that we place the moral purpose of our governments at the forefront. What greater moral purpose is there to save the lives of those tyrannized by others who would oppress them and end their own lives and the nature of their communities? We saw it before. We do not want to see it again. It is time to act.
Thank you, Ian. It was a very powerful opening to our first physical speaker today. So I'll just remind you once again, if you do have any questions, if you'd like to email them in, if you use the email hello@theus.tv, and that will get through to you. I've already had some questions come through, so the system is working. Our next speaker is Kelly Eccles-Curry, a former UN ambassador for women at large and women's issues. Kelly, if you'd like to please address the conference.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate today in this important and extremely timely discussion about a very critical issue, one that I've worked on for quite some time throughout my career. And it is really amazing to see the interfaith cooperation that is emerging around the situation in Xinjiang, as well as the efforts going on across faith communities to try to promote action and to actually move beyond just condemnation, as some of the other speakers have said. I really want to especially thank Magen Avot for inviting me to participate. And I was especially moved this morning, or it was morning here when it happened on the East Coast in the United States, when one of the first panelists spoke about the story of Moses at the well in Midian, and how Moses took a great risk to assist female shepherdesses at the well and to help them when they were being mistreated and discriminated against at the well. And it set the right tone for this wonderful conference today. And I think that that's a great segue into some of the things that I'd like to talk about how, as policymakers, as citizens in free societies, as investors in free societies, and just as human beings, we can help to address some of the challenges. And I know, as the Right Honorable Ian Duncan Smith was saying, it can be overwhelming to look at China, which is so powerful and is becoming more and more aggressive and powerful each day, it seems like, and growing economically, and think it's hopeless to try to do anything about the situation. But I don't believe that. I believe that there are things that we can do, and I believe that there are sensitivities that the Chinese Communist Party has that we can exploit. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of those things. I was intrigued to hear one of the other speakers speak about the concept of how hurting others not only harms others, but it harms oneself when you do that. There's a similar concept in Buddhism. And this is, and I think that we all have seen through our own societies how discrimination, violence, and dehumanization have created costs and consequences, not just for the direct victims and survivors of these acts, but for the societies themselves and for the majority communities that perpetrate those acts. And no society is able to escape those consequences, whether regardless of their political system. I think that China believes that they can, and that the Chinese Communist Party believes that they can carry out the kinds of atrocities and abuses that they are carrying out, and that they will not face the consequences of those acts. But I am convinced that no society can escape those consequences, and that they ultimately will have to deal with and have a reckoning with those things. I also do believe that we need to, while we do need to acknowledge the challenges of dealing with China as an abuser here, they are not 10 feet tall, and they do have certain vulnerabilities that we can exploit. In particular, Xi Jinping himself craves legitimacy. He wants to be seen as a world leader. He wants China to be viewed as a great power. He wants to be able to portray China as a great power. And so one of the things that when I was in the US government, and especially when we were at the UN, that we focused on with our own rhetoric was, how do we exploit that insecurity that really lies at some of the behavior internationally that we see from the Chinese Communist Party, some of the aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy that's really rooted in a sense of insecurity, grievance, and victimhood that the Chinese Communist Party perpetuates and fosters in order to be able to lash out and act in this aggrieved and aggressive way. So I think that we have seen that the actions to date, while insufficient, have provoked a response from the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that we need to very clearly look at what we have done so far in terms of sanctions, in terms of condemnation, international multilateral coordinated action, and try to determine what has been most effective, what has the greatest impact, and how we can lean into some of those things that have been able to have a more profound impact. For that, I wanted to focus on a few things. I tend to think of this in terms of the long-term goal, obviously, is to change the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party and to end the repression of the Uyghur and other Turkic Muslim minorities, as well as other persecuted peoples in the People's Republic of China. But in the short term, we need to focus on how we can raise the costs of those behaviors to the Chinese Communist Party and ensure that they are not able to just do these things without any consequences or any costs attached to them. So I think that diplomatically, that means that we continue to push in these multilateral spaces, in these multilateral forums, and keep building out the coalition of international voices speaking on this issue, especially in the developing world, where right now the condemnation is largely centered in the Western countries and among the developed countries. But we need to really reach out beyond our comfort zone and get developing countries involved in these conversations too. We can talk to these countries about how the forced labor schemes in Xinjiang, for instance, just serve as a subsidy for Chinese products that then disadvantages other countries that are developing and trying to break into different places on the value chain, for instance. Even if you're not able to make a moral or human rights argument with them, you can make an economic argument with them. I think also we need to really work harder at getting the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and Muslim majority countries to join in and raise their voices about this. China has been able to use their silence very strategically to block criticism and as a seal of approval for their policies and actions in Xinjiang. And we need to really get them to think about at least stop providing cover for the Chinese if they're not ready to speak out directly. And then we need to look beyond the Human Rights Council and the kind of obvious places in the UN at things like the General Assembly, at the women's organizations, the Commission on the Status of Women, other instances where the UN is focusing on gender, on climate, on development. All of these issues have a very strong nexus with Xinjiang, whether it's the Belt and Road and development in Xinjiang, or it's women and Xinjiang and forced sterilization and coercive population control, and the fact that UN agencies are still present in China, working with the same Chinese state apparatus organizations that are carrying out these policies in Xinjiang. All of these things are points that we need to be very vigorously raising across a wide range of multilateral forum, because China really has invested a lot in trying to build up its presence and its image in these forums. They invest a lot, and it's very important to them that when they get criticized, they respond very viscerally. Bilaterally, I think we need to continue to work on the sanctions. They have had an effect, especially the targeting of industries that are impacted by forced labor and implicated in other abuses. Once the sanctions are in place, it's really important that we make sure our governments are vigorously enforcing them and really working to ensure that they are taking those enforcement actions, not only against Chinese companies, but also against our domestic industries, to ensure that they have what they need to know to avoid the companies that are sanctioned and the industries that are sanctioned, as well as and helping to build alternatives. That brings me to what we as individuals can do. And I think that, and you've heard from others about how important it is to use your democratic voice and reach out to your parliamentarians. That's obviously very critical, but there are other things that we can do. And the first, and in some ways, both the simplest and the hardest thing we can do is as consumers to make sure that when we are buying products that we do check labels, make sure that we, to the extent possible, are not purchasing products made in China. It's something that I've become it's hard. I know, because I try to do it myself. And so I know that there are times where you literally cannot find an alternative. So in those instances, I will very grudgingly purchase what I need to do. But I will go to the shopkeeper, I will go to the seller, and I will say, look, I really try to avoid purchasing products made in China for these reasons. And I would really prefer to have an alternative. I'm purchasing this, but it's I would like you to try to think about stocking alternatives. And I find that it opens up a really interesting conversation with some of these retailers. I think we also need to make sure that companies like Amazon and others are very clearly labeling products, and that we are holding them to account on country of origin labels, so that we can be informed and active consumers. I think it does take a little bit of work. I'm not going to lie about that. And it can be a little bit more expensive sometimes. But I found that you often end up with a superior product. I do a lot of buying things that are used now. I even the other day bought used hooks because I couldn't find clothing hooks that were made in anywhere but China. So I went to a salvage place and found used ones. I mean, you can do it. It does require some work. And it's maybe not for everyone, but I think it is something that we should think about. The other thing we need to do is use our voices online. There are still Americans and British citizens that are working as propaganda shills for the Chinese Communist Party. They appear on YouTube and they're able to monetize their accounts on YouTube because the Chinese Communist Party engages in what's called bot fraud and uses click farms to drive traffic to these videos that otherwise nobody would give any mind to. But it's a backdoor way of paying these people to propagandize on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. And they almost exclusively, or at least primarily, do this on the issue of Xinjiang. We need to alert platforms like YouTube to these things, make sure they are correctly labeling, and when possible, demonetizing accounts that are engaging in genocide denial and also acting as agents of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Party state. So this is something that we can all do, again, just when we're online. Then the final thing that I would encourage people to do, one of the things that's most important to the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese economy is access to capital markets in the United States, the UK, and the EU. And these liquid convertible capital markets are critical to China's continued economic growth, which is in turn essential to the Chinese Communist Party's continued legitimacy and its ability to rule the Chinese people. We as investors need to be very mindful that our large index funds like Vanguard, and I'm not sure what the UK equivalents are to these things, but they invest a lot in Chinese government bonds. I've spoken with my investment advisor about making sure that we, to the extent possible, are not invested in products and in index funds that engage in these kinds of purchases. I think you're seeing our Wall Street. I can't say about the city, but I know in the United States there is a growing awareness of the risks. Certainly after the IPO that was such a problem last week with the ride-hailing app in China, Didi, and so we're trying to push this really to get to both make sure that as an investor, as a stakeholder, a shareholder in companies, that they are engaging in responsible practices, and that we're using our voice as shareholders to try to educate and to pressure companies, because they are susceptible to shareholder action. We've seen this on climate, and we're looking very closely at how the climate action and anti-racism action here in the United States to mobilize proxy votes and things like this have impacted companies, and what lessons we can learn about doing that from a human rights standpoint, because it's not enough for companies to say, oh, we're following environmental, social, and governance standards, and we're a good corporate citizen, if they're then turning around and importing products that they can't certify are not made with forced labor, or that they're working with entities in China that are implicated in abuses against Xinjiang. So those are some of the things that I'm working on, and I am trying to do both myself and encouraging my family, friends, and people I know to really do this, because it does take all of us. And it can be very disempowering to look at China and how powerful they are and think there's nothing I can do, but there are things that you can do. And as a former government official, there were things I could do in that space. And then as a private citizen, I continue to try to find those ways that I can. With that, I'm going to turn it back to our host. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. I'm just conscious of time and our ability to ask questions of our speakers. So I'll jump straight into Dr. Alan Mendoza, Director of the Henry Jackson Society.
Thank you, Matthew. And can I just say what a great conference this has been, in terms of particularly this panel already has given you a whole set of things that can be done politically action-wise in order to hold China to account for what it's doing. I mean, you've had obviously Rodney Dixon speaking about the sort of the legal approach to this, and clearly, ideally, we would want to see those responsible for human rights atrocities in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs put up in front of the International Criminal Court. And again, that's quite clear that this is something our representatives and people individually can and should be supporting. You've had, of course, Ian Duncan Smith, who has led national efforts to ensure the British government, the British Parliament, holds China to account. And you've seen some of the measures he has proposed, but also crucially internationally, using his IPAC network to drive similar discussions in other countries. And clearly this hints at what we'll be needing to be doing, which is concerted action across a multiplicity of different places. And finally, again, what Ambassador Karyasim said, looking both multilaterally, looking at the institutions where we can utilize collective support to pressure at China on the one hand, but also she's given a whole panoply of individual options that people can take. So I don't want to repeat essentially what they have said so well already. I think if you want a quick look at what can be done domestically very quickly, the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons issued a report last week which suggested things like a partial boycott of the Olympic Games. I'll come on to that in a second. I don't think that actually goes far enough. Also, of course, looking at banning imports of products from Xinjiang province. Anything made there should happen in that sort of way. They're looking at obviously helping those looking to flee from the region to come to the UK and other matters. So you've got, immediate policy things are going to be driven by politicians, and clearly everyone at home, what they can be doing is writing to their elected representatives and asking them, demanding of them the kinds of actions that we would have hoped to have happened in previous genocides to make sure that China is held to account for that. But to go back to the Olympics, frankly, I don't think it's sufficient to say that the British government should boycott it and British officials shouldn't go to a few cocktail and canapé parties at the Olympics. I have to say, I don't see why we should be going there at all as a country. I don't see why the US, other Western democracies, frankly, anyone who has a concern about human rights should be going to those Olympic Games. And I say that because I agree with Ambassador Curry that actually the Chinese do care about their international reputation. They care about it very greatly. Somewhat surprisingly, given the power they believe they hold, there is a constancy in their efforts to promote brand China internationally, to appear to be a normative state, how they operate. And as a result, the reality is that games like Olympic Games and big PR occasions like that are very important to the regime. And we've got really essentially two choices. We can either normalize them by allowing our sports people to go along and participate, even if the government doesn't. But if you do that, you're essentially giving in to what they want, because you will have a full lineup of countries, and the Chinese will shrug it off and go, well, so what if there's not a few British diplomats or the Prime Minister doesn't turn up? We've got the prize. We've got a full set of campaigns going on, or rather of sports people playing it out on the field, track and field, and it doesn't really matter what's happening in terms of the government's not coming. It seems to me much better, frankly, to come back and say we should not be going at all, really. And we've seen in the past that boycotts have an impact. The 1980 Moscow Olympics was a major example of that. It hugely embarrassed the Soviet Union to see that the US, the major athletic power in the world, was not going there on account of the Soviet Union's behavior in invading Afghanistan. And quite clearly, this is a message that we can and should send. Now, people say we shouldn't politicize sport. My answer to that is I'm sorry to say that the fact that Beijing is hosting the Olympic Games is already a politicization of sport, just as it was when Moscow held the Games, when Nazi Germany held the Games as well. You can't pretend to divorce the regime that is a host from the Games in this kind of regard. It's a farcical status to actually suggest that. So I do believe we should be going further, although it is discomforting, obviously, to athletes who've done nothing wrong to say don't go. But if we do care about human rights, if we do care what this regime is doing, we really need to hold it to account and embarrass it internationally as part of a strategy to get it to change its ways. And clearly, there is a long and arduous journey we're talking about. And it's worth for a second casting our mind back to the days of the Cold War to look at what happened in that period as a model, if you like, for how long it takes to achieve change. So if you rewind back to the 1970s, we obviously knew at the time that the Soviet Union was a strategic competitor, but we also knew but didn't do very much about the fact that it was a moral competitor, and it believed it had a system that was superior to the values of freedom, democracy, human rights that others in the world cherished and felt important. The Soviet system was entirely the opposite to that. In terms of economics, it was different. In terms of politics, it was different. In terms of, obviously, human rights abuses, completely different. But nobody until the 1970s really took this seriously as an opportunity to chip away at what they were doing. But in the 1970s, and it's very interesting to consider how this all started, one of the first groups of people whose cause was taken up by the world was, of course, the refuseniks, the Jews who wanted to leave the Soviet Union and emigrate, but were not being allowed to by the Soviet authorities. And you all know the story. Essentially, you had people who said they wanted to go, the Soviets refused to allow them, put them in prison, put them in labor camps, and there they would have languished, frankly, had it not been for the desire around the world to stand up for those people, many of whom were not connected in the slightest to the refuseniks, and say, we are not going to allow a human rights atrocity like this, an outrage like this, to determine our relations. And you started seeing marches, you started seeing rallies, you started seeing movements emerge, and you started seeing legislation, things like the Jackson-Vanik Act in the United States, limiting trade advances with how people were being treated in the Soviet Union. And that in time led to change for those people. It led to change, of course, in other areas with things like the Helsinki Accords, but the Soviets slowly were held accountable for their human rights abuses and outrages. And what I'm suggesting here is that we can start to bind China into a similar process, start to hold China to account in a way that the Chinese government will not like and will not appreciate, because it should be the axiomatic case, as long as there is atrocities going on, like what is happening in Xinjiang, that the first thing on anyone's agenda when they meet Chinese representatives, government representatives, is what about the human rights abuses? What about the genocide? And that needs to be drummed in repeatedly so that they know they're not going to get away with it. Of course, there are other matters that follow. You can look, obviously, at, of course, various economic boycotts. You can look at the capital markets access that was just mentioned. You can, of course, look at other areas as well. But we have to, I think, take a stand collectively about this. I think the lesson of the past 10 years, 15 years has been that when countries stand on their own against China, China picks them off quite easily because of economic might, economic factors. We've all seen humiliating turnarounds when governments have tried to put human rights at the centerpiece of what they're doing, only to be rolled back by a Chinese rebuff in that way. But it becomes much more difficult for the Chinese government to respond to this if collectively countries are doing this. And I think that's what our previous speakers have been suggesting happens, and clearly that is the most effective way to achieve lasting change. If we work collectively on the human rights strategy, on economic strategies, we are going to get much further than if we do it individually. So we must look at the multilateral organizations, we must look at international cooperation, we should be moving in lockstep, as I'm pleased to say we've been doing in things like sanctions, but clearly we've got a long way to go in that regard. So I suppose the key message here is, for those watching at home, it's a long haul. We're not going to get change overnight in this game. This is going to be something that will be a battle for a generation to convince the Chinese government to behave in a normative fashion when it comes to human rights and other matters. And by the way, when I say other matters, we've got a whole host of problems we know internationally. We know the Chinese government encourages theft, intellectual theft of property, it encourages espionage, all these matters that we know need to be taken into account. We know all the issues of the debt financing that goes on internationally, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is simply a way for China to essentially secure assets in other countries when they can't pay back the interest given on loans that should never have been given. We can see that the G7 have started formulating a response to some of these actions. But clearly that is a path to go. And individually, we must support our legislators, we must support governments in doing that by encouragement, by support, by doing some of the things that Ambassador Curry mentioned, but also by ensuring that our MPs like Ian Duncan Smith and Matthew Offord get told in no distinct terms that we support what they're doing as well. So the challenge is ours as much as theirs. We must make our voices heard. We must say that never again means never again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've had some questions coming through, but it seems that our speakers have anticipated some of those questions, raising issues about the presence of British representatives at the Olympic Games in 2022. Also, the issue of boycotts has been raised, and helpfully, we've seen some answers to those questions put up on the board, particularly by Kelly. So I thank you for that. So I'm going to come to our final speaker, Maria Vanderzill. As many people know, she's president of the board of deputies of British Jews, and it's been a very outspoken critic of this particular issue. So Marie, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for inviting me today. I'm really honoured. Alan Mendoza has spoken brilliantly just now, so I don't want to repeat what he's said so ably. But the most important, the critical thing, I think, is awareness raising and campaigning for more groups and countries to recognise what is happening in China. That's absolutely crucial. As a recent example, we welcome Israel's recent moves on this at the UN. Israel was amongst 41 countries at the Human Rights Council that urged China to allow immediate, meaningful and unfettered access so that independent observers could visit the Xinjiang region where the persecution of the Uyghurs is occurring. And this appears to be a change of policy from Israel's new government, and that's very applauded. We have supported, we've had reference to sanctions, for example, on Iran. This is something that I think that we should be looking towards if China, as it appears, is not going to listen for calls to respect the Uyghurs' human rights. As for the Olympic Games, the Board of Deputies is going to, tomorrow, we're going to issue a statement calling on the UK government to decline invitations. Please ask them to do that for politicians and dignitaries to attend the 2022 Beijing Olympic Games, unless the government of the People's Republic of China ends the genocide taking place against the Uyghur people in the Xinjiang region. And the Olympic Games absolutely must not be used as a tool to whitewash the atrocities taking place in China. I just wanted to also say that because of our history, many Jews do absolutely feel it's the responsibility of all of us in our community to stand up against persecution. And this year we have indeed commemorated 76 years since the end of the Holocaust of Jews by Nazi Germany. And every year on the 27th of January, on the liberation of Auschwitz, the world remembers how one of the mightiest, most advanced nations in the world sought to commit genocide against a religious and ethnic minority in its midst. Let's also remember, it's relevant as we're speaking now, Elie Wiesel once said, what hurts the victim most is not the cruelty of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystander. We've absolutely heard from everyone. Our voices must be heard collectively. We must have a strategy, and we must all speak out. The international community has failed over and over again to protect human beings from genocide. After 6 million Jews and many others were murdered by the Nazis, the world said never again. But when 800,000 people were slaughtered by Rwanda by Hutu extremists, the UN barely lifted a finger in response. And following the genocide of more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica, Kofi Annan, the late Secretary General of the UN, said, the cardinal lesson of Srebrenica is that a deliberate and systematic attempt to terrorize, expel, or murder an entire people must be met decisively with all necessary means. We are at a crossroads. At the Board of Deputies of British Jews, we ask those in power, what choice will Britain and the world be making? Are we going to stand aside and do nothing as millions of people are herded into concentration camps, as people stigmatized for their ethnicity and religion are made to do forced labor, as women are forcibly sterilized and children are removed from their parents? And in the past 18 months, as well as hosting a number of events with the World Uyghur Congress and Muslim partners to highlight this issue, and making a number of interventions with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, I want to go on record to compare China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims to the Nazis' German treatment of Jews. We've had a lot of talk about this. It's not a comparison at all that we make lightly. The Holocaust was unique, but nobody could watch the news reports over recent months about the Uyghurs and fail to notice the similarities between what is alleged to be happening in the People's Republic of China today and what happened in Nazi Germany 70 years ago. People being forced onto trains, beards of religious men being trimmed, women being sterilized, and the absolutely grim spectra of concentration camps. Earlier this year, we turned our attention, as Ian Duncan Smith has said, to the UK Parliament, holding events, lobbying MPs in support of an amendment to the government's trade bill, which would have strengthened Parliament's powers to prevent preferential trade deals, which would amount to a government dealing with countries that commit genocide. Our voice absolutely matters. Everybody's voice, every action can lead to successful actions, and there was a historic vote backed by MPs of all parties, which would absolutely not have been possible without the tireless effort of so many people, including Sir Ian Duncan Smith and Lisa Nandy, who cannot be with us today. So our voice matters. We all have to work together. The world mustn't be silent. I appreciate that we are running over time, so I want to thank you again for inviting me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. We were going to have an opportunity to ask questions. Questions coming through the forum as we continue with the discussions. And so I think we have covered that area, and I'm acutely conscious of time, and there is one more panel after this. But I have to say, if we've answered the question, political action, what can we really achieve? Well, I think the answer has been given by all of our speakers. Certainly Ian's spoke about IPAC and the way it's almost an organization within governments across the world who are seeking to take action, and perhaps in some ways embarrassing their own national governments to address this issue. which I believe has not been fully addressed by the British government. I know that's a view that Ian certainly agrees with. And Ian does actually have the distinction of being banned from the country because of his activities in the British Parliament, something which some of us find completely repugnant. Also, the issue that Kelly mentioned about Muslim cooperation, I think, is very important. There has to be more of a dialogue and more criticism and a speaking out by Muslim countries about the treatment of the Uyghurs in China. And that certainly will be a powerful voice. But so far, we haven't heard that. And that's something I'd like to see as well. Now, Alan spoke about the international reputation of China and how China is actually concerned about that. And I think the whole issue of the Olympics, like he said, in previous Olympics under totalitarian regimes, is an opportunity for us to exert greater pressure on it. And I know he advocates a delay and move approach in that we've already had a delay of the Olympics once. And so perhaps it can be delayed and even moved to another Asian country. And finally, Maurice spoke about Jewish responsibility. And I have to say, I think that's a very powerful issue, because when this issue came to Parliament, I was certainly aware of the Uyghurs, but the force of the Jewish community and the way that people approach this issue, making it clear that this is not the same as events in the past, but this was an action that we could not allow to continue. And we should not simply ignore, I think, is a very, very powerful one, and something that has resonated with me particularly. But within Parliament, action has been taken. The Foreign Affairs Select Committee report was mentioned, and that does contain some recommendations for the government. It will be interesting to see how the government respond to that. And it will give us all a leader, a direction of where we can go, not only in the use of our buying power, the boycotts that we mentioned, but also in the decisions we take about whether to engage in activities such as the Olympics in 2022. Can I thank all the speakers? It has been a really interesting discussion. Certainly something for me to go away and to think about in a bit more detail. And I think there is further action that politicians can take. But as Alan said, and I may come to regret this, it's always a good idea to lobby your representatives in Parliament and elsewhere to ensure that they are aware of your strength of feeling on the issue and not to allow people to forget. So can I thank everyone for coming along today? Can I particularly thank the speakers, who are all very engaging and very interesting, and conclude this part of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Kenningsberg. Throughout the last year, it's the Jewish community whose collective and growing voice has been loudest when it comes to highlighting the plight of the Uyghur community and calling out the horrific injustices in Xinjiang. On the streets, by lobbying MPs, in letters to the Prime Minister, and through contacting companies linked to the province or to the upcoming Winter Olympics. This timely event is yet another example of that, and Jewish News is proud to be a partner for it. The Chief Rabbi's voice too has stood out among faith leaders in this country. As he rightly said, we as a community cannot simply stand by in the wake of growing evidence of persecution against another minority. That was why Jewish News first took on this campaign long before it started to receive wider media attention. It was a story about the discovery of a shipment of tons of hair suspected to have come from Xinjiang that was the catalyst for us. We carried that on our front page with the headline, "Chilling Echoes." Not because events in China are comparable to the Shoah, but because our community knows more than most what it's like to suffer persecution. Because those images of the hair do carry echoes in living memory for many of us. And because central to the message of our amazing Holocaust survivors and Holocaust educators is that prejudice and persecution must be stopped when it first appears and never left unchecked. No matter how much condemnation we receive from the Chinese embassy for our coverage, Jewish News will continue to stand squarely and vocally with Rahima, Ian Duncan Smith, Lisa Nandy, Nuskani, and all the others who are standing up in this crucial fight. Thanks to you, Rabbi Kenningsberg, your community at Magen Avot, and the wider United Synagogue community for all the work you have done to put on today's important conference. On behalf of our editor, Richard Ferrer, and I, we hope it leads to even more activism on this crucial issue from within our community.
Thank you. Thank you there. You just heard from Justin Cohen from the Jewish News. I want to thank the Jewish News for all their work on this important issue and for partnering with us this evening as the official media partners of tonight's event. We're now going to go into the third and final session, talking about practical consumer protest. Who do we target effectively? And I'm going to hand over to Rabbi David Mason, the Rabbi of Muswell Hill United Synagogue and chair of the Haringi Multi-Faith Network, in order to chair the session.
Thank you, Rabbi Königsberg, for that introduction. Thank you to Magen Avot for spearheading what has been a really inspiring conference. We've learned so much. We've been inspired so much. We've brought so many together, and I'm really proud being the Rabbi of Muswell Hill Synagogue, and of course, along with Rabbi Harris at the Hampstead Synagogue, that we've been able to support you, Rabbi Königsberg, and your community, along with other partners here today. It's been really so important. I know that for many people here at the moment, they might be thinking about another Mason, not Rabbi David Mason, but a Mason Mount at the moment, and thinking towards the upcoming match, of course, which we're all praying for a good result. But this, in some ways, is a really critical part of our conference, which is about consumer protest. In other words, how do we target effectively? A lot of our thoughts behind this conference is encapsulated by a saying in Ethics of the Fathers, Emor ma'at va'aseh harbe, say little but do much. We've been doing a lot of talking over the last 2 or so years about what is going on in Xinjiang. We've talked to friends of ours in the Uyghur community. And I know from my perspective, Rahima Mahmoud, who spoke earlier, has been a good friend, and as someone who's talked to myself, my family, and my community about what's going on, what is actually happening. There's been lots of talking about dibur, speech, finding out, awareness. Now is the moment of asiyah, of doing, of supporting protest, of supporting what goes on the ground. And I know that there's lots going on out there. We'll come back to that, of course, a little bit later. I just wanted to go through a really great panel that we have for you. And each of the members of our panel, from a different perspective, will talk about what's going on, what they contribute, and what they feel are important ways to target actively protests on the ground. Firstly, we've got Bennett Freeman, who has previously served as Senior Vice President for Social Research and Policy of the Calvert Group, leading the social, environmental, and governance research, analysis, policy, and advocacy work of the largest family of socially responsible mutual funds in the US, based in Bethesda, MD. Bennett Freeman served in 3 positions, I think this is really critical here, as a Clinton presidential appointee in the State Department, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor from 1999 to 2001, with responsibility for bilateral human rights diplomacy. Now, I'm also going to introduce to you all Louisa Cohen Grieve. I'm really pleased you're with us. In fact, in Global Policy, I think it was, there was an article earlier this year, not long ago, by both Louisa and Bennett on the very issue of how we deal with the politics of dealing with China and the Uyghur genocide. Louisa is an expert in human rights and democratic governments, having worked 24 years at the National Endowment for Democracy. She has worked closely with hundreds of NGOs in 12 different countries, supporting them in their democracy building efforts. She now serves as Director of Global Advocacy at the Uyghur Human Rights Project. So really pleased that Louisa's with us too. We also have Mia Hassanson-Gross. Now, Mia is a director of Rene Kassam, which is a Jewish organization, the basis of which is the importance of a Jewish approach to human rights, a really special organization within Anglo Jewry, which works across the community and without the community, outside the community, and has itself a program on the Jewish reaction to the persecution of the Uyghur Muslims. Mia previously worked at Amnesty International as International Projects Advisor and acquired in-depth knowledge of international human rights work and experience. So it's really grateful, Mia, that you're with us. And Nina Friedman is with us. We felt that a voice from our student body was really important. An activist student body is so important as part of our community. And Nina Friedman, who is the president of the Union of Jewish Students, was president at Bristol University of the Jewish Society there, studied a degree in English, graduated, and her journey has taken her to be president of the UJS. That's our panel today. And so what I'm going to do is ask each of you, if you can, to speak for between 5 and 7 minutes. That might leave time for some questions as well. You can, of course, send your question in. There's an email, hello@theus.tv. I think on Facebook, you can obviously, of course, write it in. But if you want to email hello@theus.tv, please do write your questions in. Without further ado, over to Bennett to start our panel.
Thank you. Rabbi Mason. It's appreciate the introduction. And I just want to thank Magen Avot and the other sponsors of this extraordinarily important and urgent conference. I'm delighted to be on this panel with my colleague, Louisa Grieve, with whom I work together on the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor, and was delighted to hear the eloquent remarks on the first panel of our colleague, Rahima Mahmoud, and look forward not only to Louisa's remarks on this panel, but to Mia's and Nina's as well. I'll be brief, no more than 5 minutes, so maybe we can have time for questions here. And I know people are all thinking about the top of the next hour with the game about to get underway. I'm speaking not only as one of the members of the steering committee of the End Uyghur Forced Labor campaign, but also, as Rabbi Mason noted, as a former U.S. human rights diplomat, and since leaving the U.S. government now 2 decades ago, a international labor and human rights advocate. Who happens to be Jewish, and very proudly and resolutely so. I was moved by the remarks of the Chief Rabbi in his opening a couple of hours ago, pointing out so rightly that Jews have, quote unquote, a responsibility to stand up for others. That responsibility has indeed been an historical, ethical, moral, and indeed a political commitment of the Jewish community in the UK, in the US, and around the world. It's no accident that the plight of the Uyghurs has so urgently captured our attention and demanded our action. The plight of the Uyghurs has become increasingly apparent over the last couple of decades, but acutely so over the last couple of years, as serious allegations are now clearly established as absolute facts. Massive forced labor and incarceration, invasive surveillance, forced sterilization, cultural desecration. These are indeed the elements of genocide, as so many have pointed out, including President Biden. I want to pick up quickly on some of the comments made by the other speakers, particularly by Ian Duncan Smith, MP, as well as Alan Mendoza, about the geopolitical and diplomatic context here. As one who's been involved in the past in U.S. foreign policy and diplomacy, I have to say I was just so struck by how forcefully the Uyghur issue in general and the forced labor issue in particular was really at the forefront of the recent G7 summit hosted by the UK in Cornwall. And I was especially struck by how forceful and eloquent President Biden was in making clear that China must be held to account on the forced labor issue and indeed the other elements of the oppression of the Uyghurs that are so apparent. we have to move forward on the diplomatic front. We need to close the gap that's opened up where we've got the US, the UK, and Canada more explicitly acknowledging the depths and severity of the problem, the gap between those close allies and the EU and Japan. And I hope that in the coming months we can close that gap and have a more common front. That's going to take careful, painstaking diplomacy, both public and private diplomacy behind the scenes. But other forms of action. There's been mention in passing, and my colleague Louisa in a couple of minutes will be even more explicit than I in talking about the call to action as we've characterized it, that has been put forward beginning exactly a year ago by our coalition to end Uyghur forced labor, where we call on global apparel brands to sever entirely any connection whatsoever to Uyghur forced labor throughout their value chains. We've seen a number of significant commitments made by global brands to embrace the call to action and to take concrete, tangible, transparent steps to carry out the terms of the call to action. And I want to call out in particular two brands, UK brands, that have made that commitment explicitly. One is M&S, one of the great household names in the UK and much of the world, high streets all over. The other, less known but up and coming, is ASOS, who's also made that important commitment. I think that Louisa will probably call attention to the negative side of the ledger, those brands that have yet to either make the explicit commitment or to take those tangible steps. There's also been mention in the previous panel about the upcoming Beijing Winter Olympics and the calls for boycott. And certainly we need to see, at the very minimum, a diplomatic boycott. And I think that will be forthcoming from the US, the UK, and other governments. And in that context, it's just so important that the resolution pending in the House of Commons next Thursday is passed. I do want to pick up also on the comments made by my fellow American, Kelly Currie. And it's notable that she and I are so closely aligned on this issue. She, a former Republican presidential appointee, and me, a former Democratic presidential appointee. And I think that our alignment on this issue and that of Ian Duncan Smith, a prominent conservative, and labor and the liberals, of course, demonstrate that both in the US, this is an issue that has commanded bipartisan consensus and support, and similarly cross-party consensus, and we hope full support in that resolution next Thursday. There was also mention made in the previous panel in passing to the important role that investors can play, and I can comment on that very quickly from my former vantage point as a leader in the responsible investment community in the US for a number of years. And that is to say that investors are now focusing on this issue. Many labor and human rights issues command the attention of investors around the world, but the issue of the Uyghur forced labor, but the other elements of genocide that are imposed by Chinese government on the Uyghurs are now coming up rapidly, the agendas of responsible investors, at least on both sides of the Atlantic. The Investor Alliance for Human Rights has been very active in this regard, as have been several of the leading UK-based pension funds. So we need to push on all fronts here, as investors, as consumers, as citizens, as activists, to make clear that genocide, oppression, cultural desecration, forced labor are absolutely unacceptable in the 21st century, that we must have learned the lessons of history, the lessons that Jews have learned, the suffering that we've endured so horrifically in the 20th century, and not uniquely. and to take this stand of never again, but still now, there's so much to be done. So we all have our parts to play in one of the great political, moral, and economic imperatives of our time to take this common stand on this issue. And I'm just so grateful to the British Jewish community for taking such an important, urgent leadership role. Thank you.
Bennett, thank you so much for that. It is a complicated situation. The morality is clear. The Jewish approach is clear, and that's what's been so inspiring. But I think there also are so many different facets to how pressure can be brought on China from political, economic, financial perspectives. And in today's financial world, there's a lot of complications, a lot we need to learn. So to hear from you, Bennett, to open up that area, as with others, has been really helpful for us to take forward. And I think I would say that I know many here would feel that this conference is about taking things forward. It's about action that will come after. It's about where we go as members of communities from now. So, Louisa, great to have you with us. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Mason, for the introduction. I'd like to show you some images and specifically focus in on, as consumers, what can you do? So I invite everyone to contact me at the Uyghur-led organization I work for. Very proud to be serving a Uyghur advocacy group in the US, working closely with Rahima Mahmoud and other Uyghur organizations. So looking at the total technological surveillance, where is the corporate complicity here? We have lots and lots of press exposés going back to 2019 about the racial profiling, the Chinese government's use of Uyghurs as a literal laboratory of testing to develop AI using so much data input from surveillance cameras to apps to checkpoints. I want to just give you two household names. Huawei, much more of a household name, I believe, in Europe and the UK than the US. Huawei has openly said it's doing racial profiling, and then Hikvision. These two companies should absolutely be on the forbidden list for any ethical consumer and investor, as Ambassador Kelly and Bennett Freeman mentioned. Please remember these names, Huawei and Hikvision, and talk to any pension fund holder or investment advisor that has any retirement savings you have and say, I cannot hold these stocks in the emerging markets funds. And then with forced labor, we have extensive reporting, tremendous issues, not only in the Uyghur region, but across China, reported everywhere. And from household names like Nike, which has absolutely been hiding behind corporate speak, this is what they say. We have zero tolerance for forced labor. Of course, they say that it's required for access to the US market because forced labor imports are already illegal in the US and have been so for 90 years. And there's coming legislation in the UK. But the fact is, for consumers, likely 1 in 5 cotton garments in the global market are produced by state-organized forced labor of the Uyghurs. And so what can be done about it? Pay attention to the media coverage. Look at US government action as a starting place. We had an extraordinary case where 4 different US government departments issued a business advisory putting businesses on notice about their supply chains. And I want to commend the UK Parliament. 2 different subcommittees have looked at this issue, forced labor in UK value chains. So this is the coalition here, and I would just urge everyone, if you are able to look at the website, you just type in Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur Region that Rahima, Bennett, and others on this call and I are working on. And here you'll find actions, citizen actions, concerned consumer actions. You can use the hashtag forced labor fashion. And here are just some examples. Renee Kessan, just mentioned, is on this list. There's a big focus on Zara, which has, again, hidden behind corporate speak, zero tolerance for forced labor, but has done nothing to provide transparency about how it is providing cheap cotton garments without relying on slave labor of Uyghurs. There's a dedicated website, and so for those interested, what can I do? In addition to contacting your MPs, I would urge everyone to come to this website, forcedlaborfashion.org, and you can look at some of the gradings. So I'm showing you the first one here. Inditex is the owner of Zara. ASOS is on the good list, as Bennett mentioned. And so, kudos to one UK brand that has joined the very small number of fashion companies ready to show transparency and work with our coalition to have transparency and ensure that it is not using forced labor in its consumer offerings. But here you have Hugo Boss and Fila failing. So I urge you to look at these report cards, write to the corporate headquarters, use the one-click actions that you can find, for example, here. Something you can do 1 minute on social media, 5 minutes signing petitions, and in addition, going further and looking at the brand list. So you'll find this all at forcedlaborfashion.org. You can also help follow on Twitter, where you'll be able to see upcoming actions, share it with others, mobilize faith communities, trade unions, student groups, and everyone else who says, well, what can I do? Key in to some of the people who've been putting in a lot of work to research the brands and to really say which brands have done something and which have not. I'm a little ashamed to say, look, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, only 874 followers on this account. I'd love to say by the end of tonight, that should be 2,000. Let's have a campaign to say that's going to have 2,000 people, 1,000 of them in the UK, following this account and retweeting the contents to really spread awareness. Kelly Curry mentioned her own op-ed on the Olympics. So let's talk a little bit about the Olympics and, again, consumer action. This was Kelly's piece in the Wall Street Journal in March. You obviously know about the EU vote this week, and of course the upcoming UK vote, extremely important. But these are the consumer brands. These are the worldwide Olympic sponsors, none of whom have said anything publicly about their worries about being associated with Genocide Olympics. And there will be more actions coming along. If you follow the accounts I recently pointed to, you'll see more open and public pressure on these companies. Do they really want to stain their reputations of having been sponsors of what we are calling the Genocide Olympics? And finally, Mars, Snickers, if you can believe it. Well, it should be unremarkable, right? Coca-Cola is a sponsor. Snickers have gotten themselves named as the, quote, official chocolate of the Olympic Games. Mars, of course, claims that the parent company, very proud of its ESG policies, its ethics, its forced labor, and all other ethical policies. And yet there has to be a campaign to ask Mars, do you really want to be associated with the Games? There are petitions and actions, as Bennett mentioned, when people are really concerned, whether it's refuseniks or other atrocities across the world. So, here we have Switzerland. Here we have, I actually can't remember where this is. I believe this is in Germany. There's action in the UK. If you want to follow what's happening with the Olympics, follow hashtag No Rights, No Games, or this Twitter account at No Rights, No Games. You can also follow No Beijing 2022 to stay up with continued action and consumer action that will be put out via these channels. And finally, to keep up with things with mostly a US focus, but also global, I invite you to visit the website of my organization, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, and take a look at the possible actions. We're updating this frequently, and we invite you to take part. Thank you so much.
That's great, Louisa. Thank you so much. And I know the number of those following the hashtag has gone up already, and I've been following as well. So there'll be some more numbers on those accounts, which is great. Over now to Mia. Mia Hassan-Gross from René Cassan.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Magen Avot and United Synagogue, for putting this brilliant event together. So René Cassan, like David, Rabbi Mason said, represents a community that's a speaker by experience. So we work on human rights issues, drawing on Jewish values and Jewish experience to really make sure that the Jewish community in the UK today responds to some of the more prevalent human rights challenges happening in the world today. It was 2.5 years ago where I first met Rahima, and apart from the fact that I got, I think, a friend for life, I heard the story of her family, what was happening to family, happening to her people. And I had this deja vu moment where I realized I heard this story before. It's the story of my family. It's the story of my people. And it made sense that Renee Kassan, together with the Jewish community, should become what it is today, one of the leading faith communities speaking out and acting to end the persecution of the Muslim Uyghurs. Today is the 26th anniversary of Srebrenica, where 8,000 men
Mia, I think you've muted yourself. We really want to hear you.
Sorry.
That's better.
Sorry, am I back? The other one is that we need to poke the beast. Eventually, that will have an effect. And as human rights activists, if it means poking the beast, then so be it. And there are several creative ways in which this can be done, and Bennett has explained some of them, and other speakers this evening. Speaking out and showing solidarity. We can only act if we know what's happening. 2.5 years ago, I didn't know what was happening to the Uyghurs. Very few in the Jewish community knew what was happening to the Uyghurs. But once we started speaking and raising awareness, and more individuals and community members and community leaders heard about what was happening, more action happened. Some of it was practical advocacy, political, commercial action. Others were acts of solidarity. The Jewish community has hosted several solidarity iftars with the Uyghur community here in the UK. We've shared Hanukkah lighting together. We've shared Pesach and our Seder plate together. We will celebrate Uyghur music and Uyghur food together. So it's raising awareness around the Uyghurs, who they are as a people, and with that, the persecution they're facing. We need to create a negative link between human rights violation and China. Chinese companies responsible for forced labor in their supply chain, or companies that have presence in Uyghur region, in East Turkestan. And just an example, Volkswagen is one of those companies that both has presence in Uyghur region, but also in its supply chain is complicit with the use of Uyghur forced labor. So it was a month ago where we organized an international day of action outside Volkswagen dealerships. And some workers in these dealerships were horrified with what they learned. Others got angry, but the point is that became an issue. And people were talking about it. And cars that were driving past these dealerships saw these signs saying, "Stop the persecution, close the concentration camps. Volkswagen must cease any operations in a region that's killing its people." So that is happening. We heard about consumer choices and high street brands that source cotton from Uyghur region or products made from that cotton. So for some of us, it's having challenging conversations with our 15-year-old daughters on why half of the high street is now off limits until these companies make the ethical choice of changing their operations and explicit commitments. Others get inspired. And we had a Renee Kassan supporter who saw the list of these 87 companies He realized that actually a shop of, a brand of shirts that he really likes wasn't on the list, but he decided to approach them anyway. And cutting a long story short, after months on conversations, that brand has now made a commitment to close down its factory in Xinjiang region. Now, is it that individual's sole influence that achieved that? I'd like to think it is. I think every little counts. But I think there's definitely there are definitely individual choices that we can make. We mentioned the Olympics and the fact that the International Olympic Committee has granted a Chinese company known to be using Uyghur forced labor, the official contract to produce official Olympic merchandise. So again, making those choices. We heard of companies that are sponsors of the Olympics. If it's Snickers and Mars or Coca-Cola or Visa, we need to challenge their decision. It's not so much about calling for complete boycott of the Olympics, but like all the speakers here and the motion that will be voted for on Thursday in the UK Parliament, it's about a diplomatic boycott. In 1935, a year before Germany was due to host the 1936 Olympics, the UK government refused to back an appeal by British athletes to Adolf Hitler to mark the games by freeing imprisoned Jewish athletes and other incarcerated for racial or religious reasons. The Nazi regime managed to convince everyone that it would be celebrating and upholding human rights values. Let's remember that when it was granted the Olympic Games back in 1931, Germany was a republic. But when the Nazis seized power and began interning Jews 2 years later, the International Olympic Committee refused to openly criticize the treatment of the Jews for fear of irritating the host. It's happening now today. We must not fear from irritating the beast. We must poke the beast, take the diplomatic steps that are needed, the consumer individual steps from having a difficult conversation to making those choices when we're facing or in the high street and we need to decide which garments we want to purchase and shops we want to support. But going back to my first point, it's about speaking out. It's about making known what is happening so that when people, for example, hear about these brands or hear about the Olympics, they're not a celebration for China, but they'll be in our conscious known as the Genocide Games, because that is what they are. And Nike and all those brands that have not taken the steps and made the commitment to end being complicit to what China is committing against the Uyghurs in Uyghur region, and that should be known. But the immediate thing that we all need to do now is really lobby our individual MPs. The motion to call on diplomatic sanctions on the Olympics is going to be voted on Thursday. You now have the link. Please, once you enter it, you can know why you need to support it, but also you can link directly to your MP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mia. Thank you very, very much. And now over to Nina to finish up our panels. Nina, we're a little bit tight for time, but we really want to hear from you. So and of course, you know what's coming too.
Yeah.
But great.
Hi, I'm Nina, the president of the Union of Jewish Students. I first want to say a huge thank you to the organisers of the event today. I've been watching for the past couple of hours and I've been really impressed by the calibre of speakers that we have had. But more than anything, I'm really impressed by everyone's passion and heart. And I think for us to mobilise our community in this way is really something special and something I hope we can continue to do to support those in need around the world. Now, I can't profess to know as much as some of my fellow panellists about consumer protest, but I'm here to talk a bit about Jewish student activism around the Uyghur crisis. So Jewish students are very passionate and there is a real appetite for social activism among them. And for the past year, we at UJS have been focused on the Uyghur crisis because many students identified with the cause and it was close to their hearts because of the history of oppression of our own people. And we took up the cause as the first major communal organisation in the UK to vocally raise awareness of this issue. And that kind of, I think, shows you a trend. You know, young people are often the ones that are the most vocal. We're the ones putting ourselves out there. And it's a really good example of why we should always listen to our youth, because I think we do know the best sometimes. So what is it that we're doing to help? Jewish student activism has come in two forms, and I think there's a lot we can learn from how our students have taken this up. Firstly, in terms of direct action, we at UJS, in partnership with Renee Kassan, created letter templates that Jewish students could send to their local MPs. And this letter highlighted the severity of the plight of the Uyghur Muslims in China and focused on the specific Jewish student perspective, which was their moral duty, their commitment to interfaith action, and their personal connections to genocide through the Holocaust. The letter also asked MPs to commit to 5 pledges, including demand for an investigation, boycotts of products produced by Uyghur slave labour, and imposing sanctions against China. We had around 150 students accessing, personalising, and sending this letter on to their MPs, which demonstrated the breadth of interest on this topic. And in terms of large-scale activism, we learned from this that the best way to engage large numbers is to make it as simple and accessible as possible. We helped our students to make a difference and do active work to not be complicit, but we didn't demand too much of their time or effort, which allowed us to engage huge numbers. The main part of our activism, though, has come in the form of social media awareness raising. With the onset of COVID, our social media engagement increased hugely, and we capitalised on this in order to raise general awareness of the crisis. One way we did this was through a panel with young Uyghur Muslim students and activists in the UK who spoke about their culture and experience. And I personally think this was really powerful because it helped to humanise the victims of this genocide rather than just kind of presenting them as a faceless group of people. And we held many large-scale awareness-raising events in this vein. And our goal throughout has always really been to platform the people that truly understand this crisis and those who are most affected by it. I think it's great for us to get involved as a Jewish community, but we should recognise the continual importance of giving a voice and a platform to those who really need it. Alongside this, we encouraged our JSOCs to run their own localised events, and this combination of centralised and localised activity helped to empower individual JSOCs and individual student activists, and allowed us to work towards a campaign that puts students at the heart of our activism, as they are at the heart of everything we do as an organisation. Now, I'm someone who firmly believes that our young people should be our role models, our shining examples for how we want our community to look. And I would urge everyone to look to our youth and talk about the causes that they are passionate about. In my mind, if the community were as passionate as engaged as our youth, we would be in a much better place, and perhaps we could take more action on the issues that are important. The worst thing that we can possibly be is complicit, and I know that Jewish students especially are not willing to take this one lying down. So over the coming year, I hope to continue the amazing work of my predecessors. I've only actually been in this role for a couple of weeks now, but I'm hoping to continue what UJS have been doing over the past year and continue to stand up for what Jewish students think is right. We will be continuing our work to raise awareness and not to stand by as these atrocities are perpetrated against the Uyghur population. Hopefully, by working together as a community and as a people, we can ensure that never again will actually become a reality. Thank you.
That was superb. Thank you so much, Nina. And I think we've learned so much from all of our panel now. We're going to hand over now to Rabbi Königsberg to give us some final comments, but it's been a real pleasure to learn from our panel and from everyone today, actually. Over to you, Rabbi Königsberg. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Mason. Thank you to all of our panelists, to all of our speakers, to all of our moderators this evening. It has been extraordinary. It's been an extraordinary event, and I really just want to thank again all those who've worked so hard to make this a reality. In particular, I want to give thanks to Julian Pollard and to Braxina and to the whole team at Magen Avot, without whose dedication and commitment in driving this forward simply would not have happened tonight. I want to thank as well our generous sponsors, Michael Storfer, Baruch Zakaria, Paul Taylor, and Melvin Kay. And of course, I want to thank all of you. Thank all of you for joining us tonight, for watching this conference, for caring enough to take the time to learn about what is happening and to take the time to think about what we can do moving forward. I think there's one sentence that was said tonight that really stands out for me. We've heard so many things, but one sentence that we heard in the first panel: the world says never again, but it's happening again. And it's not too late to act. This evening, we've heard from faith leaders, we've heard from MPs, former UN diplomats, legal experts, human rights activists. We've spoken about the religious imperative. We've spoken about the moral duty. And we've spoken about ways to effect change through letter writing, through effective consumer behavior, through political protest, through websites and hashtags that can help us find those practical steps that we can take. We've spoken about the statements that we can make in person and on social media, and of course through prayer. This is not the end of the conversation. This is merely the beginning. We pray and hope that together we can and that we will make a change. And we know it may take time, but we cannot and we will not give up. It is my fervent hope that this conference tonight will join with other steps that are being taken and become a catalyst to end the Uyghur genocide, to usher in a brighter future for the Uyghur people and for all of humanity. We conclude tonight by pledging to continue to do all that we can to move from anguish to action and to a better future. Thank you all for being with us tonight.